Right now, there are two world superpowers vying for control. The most powerful is the US, which has long-standing alliances and trade deals and has been the main overseeing nation for the past 30 years, while China has been emerging mostly in the last decade, producing goods with its massive population while making deals to secure its power in the future. There's also been a lot of talk recently about a third world superpower, India, with its own massive population and rapidly growing economy, could become a third axis of power on the world stage. But I'm not here to talk about those three. I'm here to talk about the fourth world superpower, one that, right now, does not yet exist, but is rather being created by a handful of smaller nations. This is the continent of Africa. It's made up of 54 nations in total, some big, some small. However, Africa is kind of unique as a continent, as it's the only one that doesn't really have a continental power yet. Unlike Europe, which has Russia, and if you count it, the EU, Asia, which has China and India, the Americas, which have the USA and Brazil, and Oceania, which has Australia, there isn't a single massive nation in Africa that sort of oversees events in the region. Nigeria may be, due to its high population, but it's not as big as most of the others, especially not in comparison to the size of the greater continent. And it's kind of a mess, so it can't really dictate much of anything. But one of those massive regional nations could be forming right now. Let me introduce the East African Community. It's a group of 7 nations in Eastern Africa that have decided to gain closer ties with each other, to help each other develop and gain friendlier relations. They're Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and South Sudan, with Somalia applying in 2017 to no response. The 7 nations are concentrated around the Great Lakes region of Africa, which contains several huge bodies of fresh water. The largest, Lake Victoria, provides water for the flat, tropical, yet fairly cool Victoria Basin, which is great for farming and therefore contains most of the area's population. In 2010, they created a common market for the 7 nations, and since 2013, they've been working toward creating a regional currency, like the euro, although it's a slow and painstaking process. East African Shilling, coming out in 2024. Hopefully. This union goes farther than ones like the EU, because since 2010 there's been increasing talks of them all combining into a single country, the East African Federation. And since 2018 they've been working on drafting up a constitution, which had to be put off for a few years because of COVID. It started back up again in May of this year and will hopefully be completed within the next 1 or 2. The general idea is sort of like how India came about. Take a ton of smaller, undeveloped nations, each ethnically and linguistically divided, and unite them together to form a single, much more powerful and prosperous state that can make a name for itself on the world stage. Let's go over some of the statistics of this country if it were to form. The EAF would beat out Indonesia to be the 4th largest country on Earth, with about 312 million people. For comparison, the USA has 335 million. However, unlike the 3 nations above, which all have pretty much stopped growing at this point, the EAF has just begun its massive population boom. By 2050, it'll have 585 million people, by 2075, 840 million, and by 2100, just over 1 billion, more than China at that point. It would be the most populous African country by far, with over a 1/5 of the continent's total population. The majority religion would be Christianity at 77.5%, followed by Islam at 17%, mostly in East Tanzania, folk religions at 3.5%, and unaffiliated folks at 1.5%. At least they count them, unlike some nations. The largest city would be Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with 16.3 million people in an urban area, almost as much as New York City. I think that it being the biggest city in the East African community is kind of funny, considering it's about as far west as you can possibly go in something called the East African Federation. The country would have a GDP of 325 billion, which is honestly not that much, about the same as Romania. It's not even the highest in sub-Saharan Africa, since Nigeria and South Africa would both have it beat. But it wouldn't be third for long, because the economies of the nations it contains are some of the fastest growing in the world. The DRC and Rwanda are 7th and 9th out of about 200, and Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, and South Sudan are all in the top 30. With an average GDP growth rate of about 6% annually, if it maintains its current growth for 10 years, its economy will grow to 582 billion, about the same as Sweden. If it maintains the same rate for 20, it'll grow to just over 1 trillion, or about the same as Saudi Arabia. And crucially, its economic growth is outpacing its population growth, which means, assuming inequality remains the same, the average citizens are getting richer by a significant amount. Its combined score on the Human Development Index would be about 0.509, one of the lowest scores on Earth. below Haiti. In terms of democracy, the Economist Democracy Index treats them pretty poorly. None of them are great, but the worst offender is the ironically named Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Freedom House Index rates most members as not free, only giving Tanzania and Kenya the high praise of being kind of free. In the Fragile States Index, where 1 is stable and above 100 is incredibly unstable, not a single one of the 7 scores below a 75. Yeah, so things aren't great. Big, unstable, and undemocratic has a pretty mixed success rate. But that's not why I'm considering calling the EAF the Fourth World Superpower. Let's get into some more specific things that make it special. Number 1, cobalt is an already important material, being used in batteries and a lot of electronics. But in the coming years, it's only going to get more and more vital. It's an ingredient in the batteries of electric vehicles and energy storage used with solar panels and wind turbines. And the DRC, which would be one of the member states of the EAF, controls half of the world's cobalt. The nation already accounts for 70% of the world's cobalt production, which could make the DRC filthy rich. Number 2, the massive population boom the EAF would undergo is starting right now and would end about 2100. In 2070, while the rest of the world population is aging, with too many old people and not enough young folks to support them, the EAF will still be skyrocketing with a young workforce. This means that, like China before it, the EAF will likely become the industrial hub of the world, and massively influential as a result. By the 2070s, when the Federation is becoming internationally vital, the USA and India will only be growing very slowly, and China will likely not even be a superpower anymore due to the enormous population decline. The EAF will become the hot place for foreign economies to invest. Number 3, unlike a lot of African nations, the EAF would actually be fairly well suited to dealing with climate change. Most of the population lives in an area with a ton of natural freshwater. Hell, Lake Tanganyika is the lake with the second highest volume of freshwater on Earth, with it alone holding about 18% of the world's entire supply. Their water levels are dropping, but they're all deep enough that they won't be drying up anytime soon. And while there's some drought, the amount of rainfall in the area is actually supposed to increase a bit going forward. Plus, the basin where most people live isn't anywhere near as hot or humid as most of sub-Saharan Africa, since it's about 4,000 feet above the ocean. There'd be issues in other parts of the country, but they would be affecting fewer people, so they'd be easier to deal with. And no need to worry about sea level rise, since even the pretty unpopulated coasts are mountainous enough that they would be mostly unaffected. It's still fairly bad, but compared to the Sahel region, which is struggling with desertification, or Chad, which has exactly one water source which is almost completely dried up, the EAF is getting off pretty easy. Fifth, it would give previously landlocked countries like Rwanda and Uganda access to a port at Mombasa in Kenya. For the first time, goods across the world could travel in and out of Burundi without borders and bureaucracy. It would be massively helpful to the economies of especially Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, who would all get their first access to a seaport to the rest of the world. And sixth, it has 2 massive sources of cheap renewable energy: Inga Falls in the western DRC and the East African Rift across most of the other countries. Inga Falls is in the Congo River, the second most powerful river on Earth after the Amazon. It's also the deepest river on Earth, making it perfect for dam building. Inga Falls is one of the biggest possible sources of hydroelectricity in the world, being able to produce up to 40 gigawatts of renewable energy on its own, enough to power about 28 million homes. It would be easily the largest dam ever built, an expensive $80 billion mega project, but it would have enormous benefits and would actually have a pretty small negative environmental impact, much better than most dams. As for the East African Rift, it's an area of enormous geothermal potential around the mountains of eastern Africa. With cheap, reliable, and renewable geothermal energy, the area could easily power itself and possibly even other nations with clean energy. Kenya has already been getting on it and gets 38% of its power from heat under the earth. Okay, now that I'm done with the pros, let's get into some cons. I've already mentioned that the 7 nations that would form the Federation are mostly undeveloped and undemocratic, but I didn't really get into how bad it really is. The DRC, arguably the most vital nation of the bunch, has literally only had one peaceful transfer of power ever, and it was back in 2018. And it wasn't really democratic. Tshisekedi's election came after 2 delays by the former president not wanting to leave office, and alongside questionably true leaks about his opponent, Martin Fayulu, had actually won with 60% of the vote. Fayulu demanded a recount, but the court denied him. As for the others, Rwanda has had the same president for 23 years, Burundi elected a new president in 2020 in a questionably democratic manner, in Uganda the presidential election came with breaking up protests and rallies and a 5-day internet blackout, and the South Sudanese and Somali governments are composed entirely of a handful of people loudly proclaiming that they're senators. Kenya and Tanzania are a bit better, and I hope that they and the other nations will become more democratic as their populaces become more educated. I also think that the government of the overall EAC could be more democratic despite the undemocratic nations within, since it would not take power away from the nations it would contain. On top of that, there could absolutely be some ethnic conflict. The borders the British and Belgians drew up were pretty bad, and a lot of rival clans and ethnic groups got put together. This worked out quite badly in some places, like Rwanda, which had a full-on genocide. However, I think it could honestly be better if the nations united. Then there wouldn't be a single dominant ethnic group throughout the nation, so it would be much harder for a single one to try to snag power away from the others. It would be like reverse balkanizing. Instead of splitting up ethnically and then going to war until the end of time, it would be joining together and staying chill. In terms of language, colonialism once again really screwed them over. They've got a 50-50 split between English and French, so picking either one will suck for the other half. Plus, I think they kind of want to move away from using the languages of the colonizing nations. So instead, they've gone with Swahili, which is a language from the east coast of Kenya and Tanzania, but is also widely spoken in many of the other nations in the region. This means that kids are going to have to start learning it in school, since even though Swahili has 100 million speakers, that's only 1/3 of the total population of the potential nation. It's currently a required subject in primary schools in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and even Burundi, which never used to speak it, so it looks like it's here to stay. The issue with borders is that the different countries that would become the Federation have different levels of wealth. Burundi and South Sudan are both dirt poor and racked by conflict, while Kenya and Tanzania are generally doing pretty well. This could mean when borders open, millions of South Sudanese could flood into Kenya like a dam just broke, which could destabilize the region and cause ethnic divides. So, with all of that said, what do I think should happen to make it work? For one, for the love of God, do not let Somalia join. The plans for the EAF were already pushed back a ton when the DRC and South Sudan were let in, and Somalia is somehow an even bigger mess than those two. The EAF plans are already behind schedule. Just if Somalia is going to join, they should do it once they actually have a government. Second of all, it would probably be best to wait on letting South Sudan and the DRC join the overall federation, especially South Sudan. They can absolutely remain part of the community, but those two are by far the least developed and least democratic of the member states. So it would be way logistically harder to form a country with them as member nations. Plus, since they're two of the 3 poorest members, not including them would lower the risk of a mass migration from the massive Congo into the smaller Kenya and Tanzania. So get your currency going and drop the borders with these 5 first, invest in the other 2 when your economies are better, and then let them in once you're more developed and stable. This would make the nation a lot smaller, with only about 209 million people instead of 312, and it wouldn't have access to cobalt anymore, but it would still be really big, 8th in the world after Brazil, and so much more stable and democratic. Also, while Burundi is also a mess, it's at least a small, densely populated mess, and isn't currently at war, so it would be a lot easier to deal with than the massive spread out Congo, or the constantly warring and rural South Sudan. Third, keep funding Swahili classes. Education generally is going to be super important for this country since it has such a high youth population. If the current day kids get good educations, then not only will democracy in the nation be more stable, but it'll be much easier to use that population bulge to grow economically. Getting a lingua franca for the whole country is especially important. All the powerful nations have them. And Swahili seems like the best option. This one is going well so far, just keep it going and probably ramp it up a bit. Fourth, infrastructure is going to be super important as well. Connecting the nations together not just with politics and currency, but with transportation and energy will make it a lot more stable. Connect up your roads and your electrical grid. Also, while it would be fairly expensive, a high-speed rail going around the Lake Victoria region of the nations would not only help them connect, but would also be a huge economic benefit to the region. The situation is perfect. It's a super densely populated, fairly flat area without a lot of seismic activity. Plus, letting the members of each nation visit each other for a cheap price would not only help the tourism industry a ton, but would also let them see that, they're not all that different, and hopefully help with ethnic tensions. I would recommend it going through Burundi, Rwanda, Mbarara City, and the greater Kampala area in Uganda, Kisumu and Kisii in Kenya with a side route to Nairobi, and Musoma, Mwanza, and Bukoba in Tanzania. And finally, make sure above all else that it's a democracy. The last thing the nation needs is for some corrupt president to come into power and end up staying 3 terms longer than he's supposed to. You have the power to make a new democracy from scratch here. Promise the current leaders that they can keep their power in their nations, like governors have in the USA, but that there will be a central authority in the capital of Arusha to keep the countries together. If this government is united, it will be able to stamp out corruption in the nations one by establishing standard election laws across the entire federation. Bing bang boom, now all of them are democracies. Alright, so that was my video about the EAF and why I think it could be super important, maybe even a superpower, and how it could deal with the challenges it'll face. Keep an eye on East Africa. If this ends up going through, which it looks like it will, then they're going to become a whole lot more influential on the world stage. With all that said, if you hated the video, please leave a dislike and a comment telling me how I can improve, and if you liked the video, I can't change your actions any more than I can change the political situation in East Africa. With all that said, thank you, goodbye, and I'll see you sometime in the future.